Hey, folks, welcome to Advisory. Happy Tuesday. Now, what is that doing on my screen? Guys, I am so sorry. I should have known that was on there before I came on. I'm so sorry, guys. I was just looking at some news, and it seems as though Rangers are going to the World Series. Let's go. And I wore this hat all day yesterday. And they won, and I wore this hat the day before, and they won. So logic tells me that I never can take this hat off again if I want the Rangers to win. I'm sorry, that's just science, all right? This thing's gonna start smelling real bad. Also, one note before we get started with Advisory, don't forget to go to the testing page on Longhorn Country, click this, and look your ID up. You need to do this even if you don't think you're taking the PSAT. It's a possibility that even though you're going to your regular classes, that they may be meeting in a different room. So make sure that everybody in the building,
every student,
takes a look at this Longhorn lookup on the testing page under Longhorn Country to see what you're doing tomorrow and if anything has changed. Anyway, happy Tuesday. I hope you guys are doing well. Today, we are continuing our conversations about drugs in Red Ribbon Week. But before we go further, I would like to address something that I saw from a few of the questions that you guys have been asking in that forum, which, by the way, don't forget that if you want to ask any questions at all, completely anonymously about drugs or anything this week, you can go to Advisory. And at the very top, there is this Q&A where you can write your question there, and I will do my best to answer it. While we're here, I want to also point out that if you miss a day, you can go re-watch it or redo it by seeing the slides. All of you have access to the curriculum from every advisory we've done so far this year, so you can go back in that and catch up if you want to. And you can always go directly to the YouTube channel by scrolling to the very bottom of the advisory page. But something that I got a lot from the questions that were asked already were things like, is weed bad? Is this drug bad or is this good? And I don't blame you for asking that question because that is how we as a society have viewed drugs for years and years and years. It's either good or it's bad. And if it's bad, you don't do it. But that is not my goal this week. All right, my goal is not to put a moral judgment on whether or not something is good for you or something is bad for you. All I am trying to do is present the facts. Present the facts so that you are prepared to make your own decision. And that's what this is really about, is making your own decision with as much information as you can possibly gather before you make that decision. I know that some of us in our lives will do drugs or have done drugs, or some of you may be on drugs right now. And if that's true, I don't think that you're a bad person. I think by putting the ideas of right and wrong on drugs has made us kind of push aside those that struggle with drug addiction in a way that is not kind and is not helpful. And so you won't hear from me any sort of like,
don't do it, drugs are bad, no.
Even if I may feel like that. And I do think that some of the things that drugs will lead to are bad, like addiction, like stuff that can happen to your life or your body that we're going to talk about over the next 2 days. But I want to be very clear that I am not making a moral judgment whether someone is good or bad, whether one drug is good or bad. Somebody else asked, why don't all the vapes and stuff that get into the school get confiscated at the door? How come the monitors and the teachers and principals at the front don't take them up? And the reality is that they try to take as many as they can up, but it's not really about policing the drugs. It's not really about getting caught or not getting caught. It's not really about getting in trouble or not getting in trouble. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the decision to use a drug or not use a drug is up to you. And so even if it does slip through the cracks, even if you don't get caught, you're still doing something to your body, and I want you to make a very informed decision before you do that thing. And so whenever we're going through the information that I'm going to give you over the next couple of days, I want you to try your best to take the moral argument out of it. Try your best to not see me and other folks that you will see on these videos as berating you for doing drugs, because that doesn't work with teenagers. What is the first thing that a teenager wants to do if an adult tells them not to do something?
They're gonna go do that thing.
Let me tell you a quick story to illustrate my point. When I was like 3 years old, I had this awesome race car bed. And right beside it, I had this lamp. And my parents decided to put a very high watt, very hot light bulb in that lamp. They were new parents. They were trying, okay? And one night, whenever they finished reading to me or putting me to bed, I looked up at that light bulb after they had turned it off, and I thought,
I wonder how long it takes for that light bulb to cool off.
and so I reached my little finger up and I started screaming, freaking out. My skin boiled. I was screaming and crying, and I was like, ah! And my parents were freaking out because they thought that I had just gone to bed and was going to sleep, and all of a sudden, everything just went crazy. And they asked me, they were like, why did you do that? Why did you touch the light bulb? And I was like,
I wanted to see if it was hot.
and because my parents were sarcastic buttheads, they go, well, was it? And I was like, yeah, yes, it was. And that's exactly how a lot of us are. Someone can tell us not to do things. We can be warned about something, but we have to touch it to see if it's hot. What if it's, we're curious, right? We got to try things or whatever. So with all of those things in mind, the idea that statistically some folks in this building either are trying drugs or will try drugs in their life, and by looking at drugs not through a lens of good or bad, but just the practical things that can happen to your body and life as a result of drugs, that is the tone that we're going for. And with that in mind, I'm going to show you a series of videos today, 3 of them. The first one is going to be about how drugs in general interact with your brain. And I want you to think about, as you're watching this, what are some things that you might be learning about drugs? And one of the other questions that you're going to be thinking about in your discussion today is, what is the difference between medicine and a drug? So look for those things in this next video.
Most people will take a pill, receive an injection, or otherwise take some kind of medicine during their lives. But most of us don't know anything about how these substances actually work. How can various compounds impact the way we physically feel, think, and even behave? For the most part, this depends on how a drug alters the communication between cells in the brain. There are a number of different ways that can happen. But before it gets into the brain, any drug must first reach the bloodstream on a journey that can take anywhere from seconds to hours, depending on factors like how it's administered. The slowest method is to take a drug orally, because it must be absorbed by our digestive system before it takes effect. Inhaling a drug gets it into the bloodstream faster, and injecting a drug intravenously works quickly too, because it pumps the chemicals directly into the blood. Once there, the drug quickly reaches the gates of its destination, the brain. The entrance to this organ is guarded by the blood-brain barrier, which separates blood from the nervous system to keep potentially dangerous substances out. So all drugs must have a specific chemical composition, which gives them the key to unlock this barrier and pass through. Once inside, drugs start to interfere with the brain's normal functioning by targeting its web of neurons and synapses. Neurons are brain cells that have a nucleus, dendrites, and an axon. Synapses are structures placed along the dendrites or the axon, which allow the exchange of electrochemical signals between neurons. Those signals take the form of chemicals called neurotransmitters. Each neurotransmitter plays different roles in regulating our behaviors, emotions, and cognition, but they all work in one of 2 ways. They can either inhibit the receiving neuron, limiting its activity, or excite it, creating a new electrochemical signal that spreads throughout the network. Any leftover neurotransmitter usually gets degraded or reabsorbed into the transmitting neuron. A drug's effectiveness stems from its ability to manipulate these synaptic transmissions at different phases of the process. That results in an increase or a decrease in the amount of neurotransmitters being spread. For instance, common antidepressants, like SSRIs, stop the reabsorption of serotonin, a neurotransmitter that modulates our moods. This effectively pushes more of it into the neural network. Meanwhile, painkillers, like morphine, raise levels of serotonin and noradrenaline, which regulate energy, arousal, alertness, and pleasure. Those same neurotransmitters also affect endorphin receptors, reducing pain perception. And tranquilizers work by increasing the production of GABA to inhibit neural activity, putting the person in a relaxed or sedated state. What about illegal or illicit drugs? These have powerful impacts on the brain that we're still trying to understand. Crystal meth, an amphetamine, induces a long-lasting release of dopamine, a neurotransmitter linked with the perception of reward and pleasure. It also activates noradrenaline receptors, which increases the heart rate, dilates pupils, and triggers the body's fight or flight response. Cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine and serotonin, pushing more into the network where they boost energy, create feelings of euphoria, and suppress appetites. And hallucinogenic drugs have some of the most puzzling effects. Substances like LSD, mescaline, and DMT all block the release of serotonin, which regulates mood and impulsivity. They also have an impact on the neural circuits involved in perception, learning, and behavioral regulation, which may explain why these drugs have such powerful impacts. Even if some of these effects sound exciting, there are reasons why some of these drugs are highly controlled and often illegal. Drugs have the power to alter the brain's chemistry, and repeated use can permanently rewire the neural networks that support our ability to think, make decisions, learn, and remember things. There's a lot we still don't know about drugs and their effects, both the good and the bad. But those we do know about are the ones we've studied closely and turned into effective medicines. As our knowledge grows about drugs and the brain, the possibilities will also increase for treating the many medical problems that puzzle researchers today.
Okay, so in general, you can kind of understand that there's these neurons, there's a lot of brain chemistry going on, and a lot of different factors when it comes to putting drugs or medicine in your body. You also learned a little bit, hopefully, about how drugs and medicine are perceived, and I hope you guys have a good conversation about that later. The next video I want to go into, the next couple of videos, have to do with a couple of different drugs' effects on the teenage brain. Part of the reason that you're told so often when you're a young person to avoid drugs is because your brain is basically, well, it's still growing. It's a growing organism. It's still like mushy, like Play-Doh, and very easy to manipulate and form. Unfortunately, that means that right now, the effects of drugs and the bad side effects of them may hit you as a young person harder than it would an adult who has a developed brain. For more on that, I want to focus just on THC because I know that a lot of young people smoke marijuana and vape weed and all this stuff. And so I want to show you this specifically on how THC and weed affects a young developing brain.
When a person is smoking cannabis, one of the plant's chemicals known as THC passes from the lungs into the bloodstream. The THC is then carried by the blood to the brain, where it acts on specific cannabinoid receptors. These receptors are found in areas of the brain associated with concentration, thinking, time perception, coordination, memory, and sensory pleasures. The effects of THC activation in these areas is responsible for the high that people feel. But besides creating an altered state of mind, something else happens. In the United States, according to a 2018 survey, 1 in 8 adolescents aged 12 to 17 consumed marijuana in the past year. In 12th grade, about 1 in 16 do so daily. So what's the problem? Even super smart people smoke, right? Let's look at the effect of cannabis on a teenager's brain. The brain's response to counter the effects of THC impairs its attention, its ability to remember, and its potential for learning. These effects can last up to several days. This would not be such a problem if our brain ran like a machine, but that's not the case. The brain is a living organism, maybe the most precious one there is. In teenagers, that organism is still immature. It takes about 25 years for the human brain to be fully developed. This is why when teenagers and adults argue, they often come to different conclusions. There is a biological reason for that. Adults have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for judgment and an awareness of long-term consequences. The cortex of teenagers is still growing. They are more influenced by their already matured limbic system, which responds to fears and emotions. If the developing brain is exposed to a lot of THC, the part responsible for controlling emotions may never reach its full potential. This can have long-term consequences and effects on one's measurable intelligence, learning, and judgment. One study that followed 13-year-olds for 25 years has found that those who regularly consume marijuana lose on average 5.8 IQ points by the time they reach adulthood. Since our average IQ is just 100, that is enough to shut the door to a good college or close the opportunity to work at a great company. But that's not all. There is also evidence that some teenagers that use cannabis are at higher risk of developing depression or even a psychosis. A psychosis changes the way the brain processes information and causes you to lose touch with reality. You can see and hear things that aren't real and may completely lose your mind. In short, the high of cannabis comes with a multitude of side effects. Some might be fun, some might be healing, and some are potentially horrible. We don't always know. If you want to live life with the ultimate learning machine inside your head, you might want to wait until your mind is fully developed before trying weed.
Okay, so again, you heard that at the end of that video, he said that we really can't know exactly from person to person how weed will react with a person's system. On a young person's brain, on an older person's brain, there are a lot of risk factors. Sometimes it can be used, they've found, for healing purposes. Sometimes some of the side effects are pretty fun, but a lot of it is unknown. And that is the scary part. A big part of the unknown is how THC and other drugs interacts from person to person. It's not like everyone has the exact same experiences, and some of those experiences that people have can be pretty dangerous. And again, it's just good information to know. It is one more tool in your tool belt on making an informed decision. Okay, in the last video that I'm going to show you, actually, I'm probably not going to be able to edit it into this video, so I'm going to have you just go to the next slide and watch it, and then have the discussion over all 3 videos after that. But the next video covers specifically vaping. It does talk a lot about nicotine, but it covers a lot of things about vaping in general. But for now, I want you to think very carefully about the facts that you see about vaping, and keep in mind that vaping is a relatively new thing. She'll mention this at the end of the video, but it took like 120 years for us to finally figure out that cigarettes were not that great for you. Vaping has only been around since like the last 10, 15 years, and so the long-term effects of vaping, we're not exactly sure, and we're kind of in the middle of figuring that out. Also a good thing to keep in mind. So go ahead and watch that video on the next slide and then have the discussion over all 3 videos with your advisory class. I hope that you are learning a lot. And if you have any questions for me to answer on the video, I will be doing that mostly on Friday. And so get your questions in on Longhorn Country under the advisory page. That's all for me. Be good to yourself and others, and I'll see you real soon.